When I was around 12 years old, I spent New Year's Eve at my friend's house while our parents went out to dinner in a nearby town. The house was ancient and isolated, nestled far from any neighbors, which made it feel incredibly eerie. To reach it, you had to drive up a long, overgrown path lined with towering trees that nearly obscured the sky. Some kids at school claimed the house was haunted, and I even heard it was mentioned in a ghost book, adding to its creepy reputation. That night, as my friend and I sat in the living room watching TV, a sudden, deafening crash shattered the silence. I can still vividly recall the wide-eyed terror we exchanged as we froze, unsure of what to do. After gathering enough courage, we crept out of the living room, our footsteps hesitant, and ventured down the hallway toward the source of the noise. The sound seemed to have come from upstairs, so we cautiously climbed the staircase. At the top, we were hit by an icy breeze, unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just cold, it was bone-chilling, as if we had stepped into a freezer. We followed the draft down a dim hallway that stretched on endlessly, the high ceilings and shadowy corners making it feel like a mansion from the early 1900s. Every creak of the floorboard seemed amplified, as though the house itself was alive and watching us. At the end of the corridor, we saw the door to his parents' bedroom slightly ajar, creaking as it swung back and forth. We stopped, too terrified to move. My friend eventually broke the stalemate, inching toward the door while I lingered behind, paralyzed by fear. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, vanishing into the darkness. I could barely make out his silhouette, and for a moment, everything was eerily quiet. Then, his blood-curdling scream shattered the silence. My heart raced as I bolted into the room, fumbling for the light switch. When I turned on the light, I saw him standing rigid, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror, fixated on an empty corner of the room. Beside him lay a massive antique mirror, shattered into countless shards scattered across the floor. Carefully avoiding the broken glass, I stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. His skin felt ice cold, as though he had been standing in that freezing breeze for hours. "Are you okay?" I asked. Without looking at me, he whispered, "She broke the mirror." His voice trembled, filled with disbelief. "Who broke it?" I asked, confusion mixing with my fear. Slowly, he turned to me and muttered, "The woman in the corner." Chills ran down my spine, but I tried to dismiss his words, telling him we should leave. He agreed, and we began walking out together. Just before we exited, I couldn't resist checking the mirror. I thought maybe the wire holding it had snapped or something. Carefully, I bent down and inspected it. To my surprise, the string was intact, and the nail in the wall was still secure. There was no logical explanation for how the mirror had fallen. Panic set in, and I told my friend to call his parents and ask them to come home immediately. We waited outside by the front door, too frightened to remain inside the house. When our parents arrived, his dad and mine went upstairs to inspect the room. They found the broken mirror but dismissed our story, assuming we had been playing some kind of prank. Years later, at the age of 24, I brought up that night during a conversation with my mom. As I recounted the events, she listened intently. When I finished, she gave me a serious look and said, "I believe you. A few days after that night, your friend's mom told me she saw a woman in her bedroom. The woman told her to leave the house." Hearing this made my hair stand on end. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. The thought of the woman in the corner and the mysterious way the mirror fell still haunts me, and I try my best to push it out of my mind. I never imagined anything unsettling would ever happen to me. I had always been fascinated by real-life scary stories, but I figured my overactive imagination and slight paranoia were just part of the fun. That changed a few years ago when I was 19. It was New Year's Eve, and I was returning home after watching fireworks with my friends. By the time we got back to my quiet and safe Sydney neighborhood, it was 3 a.m. The streets were silent, and everything seemed peaceful, just as it always did. My friends wanted to call a taxi, thinking it was too late to wake our parents for a ride, but I insisted we walk. It was a long walk, but I felt confident. Aiden complained the entire way, which I couldn't blame him for, but Benjamin stayed quiet and followed along. I was in high spirits, even laughing occasionally, as we got closer to my street. At that point, we decided to split up. Aiden and Benjamin continued their longer walk home, and I turned on to my much shorter route. As I passed a small cake shop, I noticed a man on the opposite side of the street. He glanced up at me quickly, and the way he did it made me uneasy. Shrugging it off as paranoia, I walked faster. I turned onto my street, surprised by how much darker it was than I expected. By now, it was around 3:15 a.m. The road ahead, lined with trees and the empty bowling club, felt uncomfortably still. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, so I glanced back a few times, but I didn't see anyone. Halfway down my street, where the road slopes downhill, I noticed something lying on the path ahead. I couldn't make out what it was, so I stepped onto the road to avoid it. As I turned slightly, I caught sight of someone behind me. They weren't far away, but they weren't too close either. My heart began racing. I hadn't heard or seen them before, and their sudden presence unsettled me. At that moment, it struck me as strange. Why would someone be quietly following me at 3 a.m.? If they were harmless, surely they'd try to reassure me by keeping their distance. I tried to look at them again but could only make out a dark, shadowy figure, no defining features, just an outline. Panicking, I pulled out my phone and tried to call Aiden, but the call wouldn't go through. I called Benjamin several times, but he didn't pick up. My nerves were on edge, and I didn't dare look back again. When I finally reached my driveway, I felt a wave of relief and hurried up the path. Halfway up, I glanced over my shoulder and saw the figure again. This is the part one can't explain clearly. It seemed like they were just passing by on the street, but at the same time, it looked like they were about to step onto my driveway. For a split second, I thought it might be my brother Jonathan, but something about their shape didn't seem right. Even though I felt safer being close to my house, I couldn't shake the unease. Thankfully, my mom had stayed up to wait for me and opened the door as soon as I knocked. I was relieved beyond words. Once inside, I left the second door open and kept the outdoor light on, thinking Jonathan might arrive soon. But when I mentioned it to Mom, she told me Jonathan had been home for hours. The realization hit me hard, but I tried to dismiss it as paranoia. I turned off the light, closed the door, and went to grab a glass of water before heading to the bathroom for a shower. I texted Aiden to let him know I got home safely and asked why he hadn't answered earlier. While showering, I started replaying everything in my head. Was someone really following me? I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Near the end of my shower, a strange noise at the bathroom window made my heart stop. It wasn't the usual creaks or bumps an old house might make. It sounded like someone pressing their hands against the glass, steadying themselves. I froze, turning off the water and crouching below the window. My mind raced as I waited in silence, too scared to move. After what felt like forever, I stood up cautiously and turned off the bathroom light. Still needing to dry off and get dressed, I turned on the dim heater light instead. That's when I noticed faint blue lights outside the window, small, glowing dots like the keypad of a phone. My fear spiked. I backed into a corner, clutching my towel, afraid to make any noise. The blue lights moved around, growing brighter and shifting as if the person outside was trying to look in. Finally, I unlocked the door and ran to my parents' room, trembling as I tried to explain what was happening. My dad hurried outside, and a few moments later, he heard footsteps running away down the path. That confirmation made everything real. It wasn't just my imagination. I didn't sleep that night, terrified by the thought of what could have happened. The next morning, I felt shaken but thankful that I was safe. Since then, I vowed never to walk home alone at night again. Girls, please don't take chances. It only takes one moment for something to go terribly wrong. On New Year's Eve in 2016, something extraordinary occurred in Zacapa, Mexico. My family and I visit the town every year for the holidays, staying in an apartment we've owned for a while. It's always a wonderful escape for my dad from his busy work life. Our apartment is part of a larger building complex, which consists of 24 units spread across 4 identical towers. That year, one of the residents hosted a New Year's party in their apartment, located on the 4th floor of one of the towers. They invited us along with many other families, and by the time we arrived around 10 p.m., the place was lively with about 35 guests. The plan was to spend the night celebrating together. Around 10:50 or 11 p.m., one of my mom's friends suddenly pointed to the sky, claiming to see something unusual. At first, most of us ignored her, continuing our conversations, but after a couple of minutes, the growing excitement pulled our attention. Curious, we all stepped out onto the terrace to see what the fuss was about. What we saw was perplexing. Initially, it just looked like stars twinkling in the sky. But these stars were clustered unnaturally close together and flickered in an irregular pattern. As we kept watching, more of these strange lights appeared, shimmering in odd, quick bursts of brightness. A few guests dismissed the spectacle as a simple case of overactive imaginations, but things took a bizarre turn. The stars we initially assumed were static began to move, drifting toward the area where the other twinkling lights were gathered. The atmosphere shifted, excitement turned into a collective unease. I've always been open to the idea that we're not alone in the universe, but seeing this was surreal. Soon, there were so many lights that it was impossible to count them all. Everyone estimated the number to be somewhere between 100 and 150. As the last of the moving lights joined the cluster, they all continued to twinkle in an unnatural rhythm. Their light was unlike the soft dimming and brightening of real stars. It was sharp, like electric bulbs flicking on and off rapidly. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the entire formation began to drift across the night sky in unison before vanishing completely. We all stood there, stunned, our mouths agape. Some people attempted to capture the phenomenon on their phones, but the lights were too far away, and nothing appeared on the cameras. Despite this, the fact that 35 people witnessed the same thing assured us it wasn't just a shared hallucination. Later, the apartment owner's son shared an intriguing detail. The year before, someone had told him a similar story about strange lights on New Year's Eve. At the time, he dismissed it as a silly tale, but now it seemed impossible to ignore. To this day, my family and I often talk about what we saw. We've tried researching potential explanations, natural phenomena, weather events, anything, but we haven't found answers. Whatever it was, it remains one of the most mysterious and unforgettable nights of my life.